I couldn't breathe as I scrolled through the messages, my hands trembling as I held my husband's phone. The name on the screen read Jenna. Someone I didn't know. In a stream of messages, flirty and deep, he'd been pouring his heart out to this stranger. Except she wasn't a stranger to him, not anymore. They'd been chatting for weeks, maybe even months. As I read, my heart pounded against my chest, and I felt a wave of betrayal that made my stomach twist. It was strange how he'd let his guard down with her, this faceless woman online. Using a name I'd never heard before, Mike, he shared secrets, frustrations, and dreams, some of which he'd never shared with me. Who was this man that had fallen in love with someone else under a disguise? An idea started forming in the back of my mind. A bitter, twisted little idea, born from my anger and pain. What if I pretended to be her? I knew enough about her already from their conversations, her favorite books, the way she teased him, the kinds of questions she asked. Maybe I could step into her role and see just how far he was willing to go for this new relationship. I'd play along, not as his wife but as this woman he seemed so enamored with, just to understand what he was seeking that I couldn't give him. My heart pounded as I set up a new profile, taking on her name, borrowing bits of her supposed personality, and even finding a picture that I thought might fit his type. The moment I sent him a message, my pulse quickened, a thrill of nervous energy mixing with the icy bitterness of betrayal. Would he take the bait? Would he realize it was me? I crafted the first few messages carefully, responding with the kind of charm and lightheartedness I'd seen him fall for. And to my surprise, he replied almost instantly. At first, I kept our conversations light, mimicking Jenna's easygoing tone, teasing and joking just like she had. He responded with that same eagerness I'd seen in their earlier conversations, and every reply stung. I wondered if he even hesitated before diving back into our flirtation. As the days went by, I pushed him further, testing his loyalty, his integrity, if there was any left. I hinted at wanting to meet, at wanting something real. And he didn't pull back. If anything, he leaned in, drawing me further in with every sweet message, every compliment. The pain was sharp and immediate every time he called me beautiful, every time he spoke of the future, a future that, apparently, he could imagine with her. It was like he was rewriting the story of our marriage, only with someone else in my place. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. As Jenna, I began to ask him why he was doing this, why he hadn't told his wife about his feelings. I asked what kept him from being open with her, hoping he'd reveal some shred of remorse. But he didn't. Instead, he seemed to grow even more frustrated with the confines of his marriage. He complained about being misunderstood, about the lack of excitement, about how his wife didn't see him the way he wanted to be seen. The worst part was how much he enjoyed having someone he thought was new, someone to whom he could reveal only his best parts, leaving out the flaws, the history, the mess. I saw his willingness to be anyone but himself, to chase after a fantasy, even if it meant betraying me, betraying us. One night, as we lay in bed, him inches away but feeling 1,000 miles apart, he checked his phone. I watched the screen light up with the notification. New message from Jenna. He glanced at it, not realizing it was me lying right there beside him, holding the secrets he was so desperately hiding. My anger reached a boiling point as I wrote to him the next day, asking him if he was ready to take things to the next level, if he was willing to meet in person. I could almost see the eagerness in his typed response, how he'd been waiting for this. He suggested a time, a place, a little cafe just outside of town, somewhere he'd never think to take me. The audacity of it sent a shiver down my spine. He was going to meet me, and he had no idea. On the day of the planned date, I watched him as he got dressed, a slight hint of cologne, clothes he usually reserved for our date nights. It broke my heart and infuriated me all at once, seeing how far he was willing to go for this imagined connection. He kissed me goodbye, a strange guilt lingering in his eyes, as if he knew he was doing something wrong but had already decided it was worth it. I arrived early at the cafe, positioning myself where he wouldn't see me right away. He sat by the window, checking his phone, glancing up every so often with a look of anticipation that made my stomach turn. For a moment I thought of just walking away, letting him sit there and face the emptiness he was creating. But I couldn't. I wanted answers, needed to confront him with his lies. Finally I approached, my heart racing as I sat across from him. His face fell as he saw me, shock, horror, and guilt flashing across his expression. He was speechless, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "So," I began, my voice calm but laced with the hurt he'd caused. "How's Jenna?" he stammered, the color draining from his face. And I watched as he searched for words, explanations, anything that could justify what he'd done. But there was no explanation that could make this right. I asked him if he ever thought of our marriage while he poured himself out to a stranger online, if he ever thought of the promises we'd made. He had no answers, no excuses that could undo the damage, the betrayal. In that moment, I knew our relationship had been irreversibly changed. I'd seen a side of him I couldn't unsee. A man who would rather chase a fantasy than work through reality. And as I left that cafe, the weight of the betrayal heavy on my heart, I knew one thing. He'd been in love with someone else, even if that someone else had been me all along, hidden behind a screen. I walked out of that cafe with my heart in pieces, feeling raw and numb. The air was thick with the weight of what I had just uncovered. My husband had let himself fall in love with an illusion, all while I stood right in front of him, painfully real. As I drove back home, memories flooded my mind, each one tainted now with questions. When he'd held me, whispered he loved me, was it truly me he loved? Or just the idea of someone? Did he even know who I was anymore? Or had he replaced me in his mind long ago with someone more thrilling? Someone untouched by the routine of marriage? When I got home, I was met with silence. His absence was stark, the house feeling like it belonged to a stranger. I poured myself a glass of wine, each sip bitter and sharp, but it grounded me, giving me a strange sense of calm. I was done being the passive player in my own life. This wasn't going to be something I'd let him explain away or sweep under the rug. If he was really willing to throw everything we built together for a fantasy, I needed to know the truth of why. And in some twisted way, I wasn't sure if I'd ever get the answers unless I continued playing the role of Jenna. So I did. That night, with my wine glass nearly empty, I typed out a message to him as her, asking him how his day had gone, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. Part of me wondered if he'd still respond, given that he had been caught. But within minutes, a new message arrived. "Today didn't go as I'd hoped, Jenna. I feel terrible and I can't stop thinking about you." The nerve of him. My fingers hovered over the screen, wavering between fury and some strange curiosity. How far could he lie even now? Did he think he could manipulate his way back into his double life? I replied slowly, carefully, asking him why he felt bad, wanting to see if he'd reveal anything about our confrontation at the cafe. He typed out a long message and each word stung more than the last. "I just feel stuck. Like the real me isn't able to come out. You're the only person who really knows me, Jenna. I wish I could tell you how much this matters to me. But sometimes I feel like my life's too complicated to do what my heart wants." My heart clenched as I read his words. He wasn't going to confess, wasn't going to own up to his deceit. Instead, he was doubling down, clinging to his fantasy as if he could still make it real. I felt the anger in my chest, hot and consuming. If he was determined to keep pretending, then I would too. As Jenna, I asked him what he wanted to do, how far he was willing to go to live the life he truly wanted. His response was immediate, raw, and filled with desperation. "If I could," he said, "I'd leave everything behind. I'd just start over, just you and me somewhere new. I want to be free, Jenna. Free to love without feeling trapped by responsibilities, expectations." It was in that moment I realized just how deeply he deluded himself. He wasn't just flirting or looking for an escape. He was creating an entirely new identity, a new life that he thought he could run to, leaving behind his real one and me. He wanted to be with Jenna, not just as a lover, but as someone who symbolized freedom, excitement, and a chance to be someone else. In my mind, I crafted a new plan. I would make him face every fantasy, every promise he'd made as Mike. I wanted him to know what it felt like to chase something so hard only to realize it was never real, never possible. I responded, "If you really mean that, then prove it. Show me that you'd be willing to leave it all for me. I'm tired of waiting in the shadows, being second in your life. If you really want me, you have to be ready to make a choice." Over the next few weeks, I watched as he grappled with that decision. He seemed nervous at home, quiet and distant, clearly preoccupied. And all the while I played along, fueling his illusion of freedom, with sweet promises of a fresh start. I didn't feel guilty anymore. In fact, I felt strangely liberated. He had become trapped in the web he'd spun, and every time he tried to pull away, he only tightened the threads around himself. Finally, one night he came to me and said he wanted to talk. There was a heaviness in his gaze, as if he were holding some monumental truth that would shatter everything. I prepared myself, setting aside any lingering hope that he might finally come clean, that he'd choose me over his fantasy. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he started, his voice low, almost strained, "about our lives, about what we want, what I want." He reached for my hand, and I felt his grip was weaker than usual, tentative, as if he were already letting go. I feel like we've grown apart. I don't want to hurt you, but I need something different. Something more." It was surreal hearing him confess without actually confessing. He still wasn't brave enough to tell the full truth. "Something more," I repeated, my voice cold and empty. "And what exactly is more to you?" He faltered, realizing he'd pushed himself too far. But his face betrayed him. He looked almost relieved. He thought he'd finally found a way to slip out of our marriage without ever confronting his deception. It was then that I knew he wasn't the man I'd married, not anymore. Or maybe he never had been. This was his true self, willing to cast aside love and loyalty for an escape, for a fantasy that would never be more than words on a screen. Taking a deep breath, I looked him squarely in the eyes, my voice steady. "If that's what you want, if you're so sure of it, then I won't stand in your way. Go chase your fantasy. But I hope you understand that the life you think you want, the person you think you love, they're nothing but shadows. And when those shadows disappear, you'll have nothing left." I left him that night, moving into the guest room and packing my bags the next morning. There was no turning back. For weeks, I watched him try to piece together the broken parts of his fantasy, only to realize that he was left with nothing but himself, a man alone in his deception. And as for me, I'd let go of the illusion he'd cast over our marriage, ready to face my own future, free from shadows and false promises. Leaving that house felt like peeling off a layer of my own skin. I'd spent so many years there, pouring my heart into making it a home, investing my time, my love, my trust, all for it to end in such a hollow, ugly way. I hadn't left out of anger, not anymore. It was the pain of realizing that our entire life together was a lie that I hadn't even known I was part of. And he, still wrapped up in his self-made fantasy, was too lost to even feel the consequences of what he'd done. I left with only the essentials, shutting the door on what felt like an entire lifetime. In the weeks that followed, the numbness was a strange comfort. I was half in shock, half on autopilot as I arranged a small apartment for myself, trying to focus on mundane tasks like unpacking or setting up bills to distract myself from the deeper, unanswerable questions. Why hadn't he been honest? Why had he felt the need to seek validation and excitement in someone who didn't even exist, rather than coming to me and being honest about what he felt was missing? After a few weeks, I noticed a series of missed calls and texts from him. His messages were short at first, formal, almost cold. But soon they grew desperate. Each new message was tinged with regret and confusion, and the more he reached out, the more I felt myself slipping into the role of Jenna again. This time, though, I wasn't hiding behind an alias. I was the wife who had walked away and left him stranded in his own lies. Finally, after a few ignored calls and a series of pleading messages, I picked up. He sounded relieved at first, but that relief quickly turned into a stream of excuses, awkward pauses, and clumsy apologies. I listened quietly, letting him talk himself into knots, explaining how he'd made a mistake, how he didn't mean to hurt me. It was clear he wanted my forgiveness, some chance to ease his own guilt. But what he didn't realize was that I'd already come to terms with everything he'd broken in our marriage. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I asked, my voice low and calm. "If you felt trapped, if you wanted something new, why couldn't you just be honest with me?" There was a pause, the silence on his end thick and loaded. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I was scared. Scared that you wouldn't understand. That you'd leave. But you do realize that's exactly what happened, right?" I replied, feeling the weight of my words hit him. "You thought you'd lose me if you were honest, and yet you lost me anyway. Only now it's worse. Now I don't even know who you are." He was quiet, his breathing heavy. "Can't we try to fix this?" he asked after a long pause. Can't we at least try? A pang of sorrow hit me. Whether for him, for us, or for the life I thought we had, I wasn't even sure. But I knew that whatever we'd had was gone. His betrayal had severed that last thread of trust, leaving nothing but an empty shell. I don't think there's anything left to fix, I replied, my voice steady, even as a wave of sadness washed over me. You chose a fantasy over our life, over everything we'd built. I can't pretend that doesn't matter. The line was quiet, his silence carrying a sense of finality. I ended the call, feeling a strange mixture of closure and emptiness. I hadn't thought it would be so hard to say goodbye, but I realized that I wasn't just saying goodbye to him, I was saying goodbye to the future I had imagined with him, to the person I had believed he was. Over the next few months, I worked on rebuilding my life one small step at a time. I started therapy not because I wanted to dissect every painful moment, but because I needed to understand how I could have been so blindsided. Had there been signs I'd missed? Moments I had dismissed as just part of marriage? Through therapy, I began to unravel years of small doubts, moments where I had questioned his sincerity, only to brush it off, telling myself that all marriages had their rough patches. I realized I had spent years giving him the benefit of the doubt, always assuming the best, even when I should have trusted my instincts. It was painful, but it was liberating. I had been living for both of us, carrying the weight of our relationship alone. As I moved forward, I began to rediscover pieces of myself that had been buried under years of compromise and self-sacrifice. I took up painting, something I hadn't done in years, pouring my emotions onto canvas as a way to process the hurt and confusion. I reconnected with friends I had drifted away from, realizing how much I had let my world shrink around our marriage. Slowly, I started to feel whole again, as if I were piecing together a version of myself that I hadn't seen in years. And as for him, he reached out occasionally, leaving messages that I only listened to out of some lingering curiosity. Each time, his voice sounded a little more defeated, a little more hollow, as if he were finally realizing that his fantasy hadn't brought him the happiness he'd been chasing. He was stuck in the life he had chosen, and I could hear the regret in every word. He had thought he'd found freedom, but all he'd found was loneliness. One day, months after I'd left, he sent a message saying he wanted to meet. He wanted to apologize in person to try to make things right. Against my better judgment, I agreed, feeling a strange sense of curiosity to see how he had changed, or if he had changed at all. We met at a small cafe, a different one this time, but I couldn't shake the memory of that first confrontation. He looked worn, as if the weight of his choices had finally caught up with him. He stumbled through an apology, his eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. He told me he regretted everything, that he had been wrong, that he had thrown away the best thing he'd ever had. But as he spoke, I realized that his regret wasn't for the hurt he'd caused me. It was for the consequences he now had to live with. He missed the life we had, the stability, the comfort, but he still couldn't see past his own mistakes, couldn't understand the depth of the betrayal. It was clear that he wanted forgiveness not because he wanted to change, but because he wanted relief from his guilt. I listened to him quietly, letting him get it all out. And when he was finished, I looked him in the eye and told him the truth I had come to understand. I've moved on. I can't go back to what we had because it wasn't real. You chose to love someone who didn't exist, and I can't be that person for you. I can only be myself, and that's not enough for you. It never was. His face crumpled, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. But I knew that I couldn't let myself be drawn back into his web of self-deception. I had to let go truly for both of us to find our own paths. As I walked away, I felt a strange lightness, a freedom that had been a long time coming. I knew that this was the final chapter, that I had closed the door on that part of my life. And for the first time, I felt ready to open a new one, to embrace a future that was mine alone. It wasn't the future I had planned, but it was real, and that was enough. In the days that followed that final meeting, I expected to feel regret, sadness, maybe even a bit of anger. But instead I felt something strange, peace. For the first time in what felt like years, my heart felt calm, unburdened. I wasn't waiting for an apology or an explanation anymore. There were no lingering hopes or what-ifs. I had seen the truth of my marriage, the person I had been married to, and I had let go. It was a quiet sort of closure, the kind that settles over you not with a bang but with a sigh. Still, moving forward felt surreal. I'd grown used to the routines we'd built over the years, the familiarity of a shared life. It took time to adjust to a world where I wasn't considering his preferences, his routines, his moods. Every choice I made now, whether it was deciding what to eat for dinner, what movie to watch, or what to do with my weekends, felt both foreign and liberating. The silence in my apartment was mine alone, and though it felt lonely at times, it was also freeing. I could be anyone, do anything without the constant weight of compromise. Friends and family noticed the change in me too. I wasn't the same person they'd known during my marriage. There was a new energy, a lightness that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I threw myself into my passions with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt in years. Painting became more than just a hobby. It was a lifeline, a way to process everything I'd been through. Each brushstroke felt like a release, a way to tell the parts of my story that words couldn't capture. In my newfound independence, I also discovered something unexpected, a deep, unshakable gratitude. Not for him or the pain he'd caused, but for the lessons I'd learned about myself. I'd faced my worst fears, the kind of betrayal that shakes you to your core, and I had survived. I was stronger, more resilient than I'd ever given myself credit for. I realized I didn't need someone else's validation, didn't need to cling to an idealized version of love to feel whole. I was enough just as I was. Months passed and gradually, life took on a new rhythm. I stopped checking his social media, stopped wondering what he was doing. If he had found someone else, it didn't matter. His choices no longer had any hold over me. The person he had been with me, the person he had become without me, they were both strangers now. One day, as I was out with friends at a small art gallery, admiring a series of abstract paintings, I met someone new. His name was Lucas. He was kind, attentive, and he listened in a way that felt genuine, not forced. There was no rush between us, no pressure. We spent weeks getting to know each other, sharing stories over cups of coffee, and taking long walks around the city. He knew my story well, parts of it, the parts one was ready to share. And he never pushed me for more than I was comfortable with. With Lucas, I felt a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. There were no facades, no hidden expectations. Just two people, each with their own scars, finding solace in each other's company. I didn't know where things would go with him, and for once that didn't scare me. I wasn't looking for someone to fill a void or to rewrite the past. I was ready to write a new story, one rooted in honesty, respect, and a shared commitment to growth. Through it all, though, the past was never completely forgotten. There were moments when a memory would surface, unexpected and sharp, reminding me of the life I had left behind. But instead of bringing pain, these memories reminded me of how far I had come. They were part of me, yes, but they no longer defined me. I continued to paint, pouring every lesson, every triumph, every quiet moment of healing into my work. Eventually, I held my own exhibition, a series that captured my journey from heartbreak to self-discovery. The gallery was small, intimate, but as people walked through, stopping to admire the pieces, I felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't known I was capable of. This was my story, my truth laid bare for anyone to see. As the evening came to a close, I took a moment to step back and observe. I realized I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared for me, people who had supported me through the worst and celebrated with me through the best. I felt a warmth that went beyond romance. It was the love of friendship, the strength of community, the resilience of self-love. In that moment, I knew that no matter what lay ahead, I was ready. I had found my way back to myself, and that was a journey worth every step. In the quiet moments after the gallery event, as I walked home under the streetlights, a profound sense of fulfillment settled over me. I hadn't felt this complete, this steady in what felt like a lifetime. There had been so many nights when I'd laid awake, tangled in thoughts of what could have been, haunted by the love that had turned to betrayal. But now those ghosts had softened, their edges blurred by time and healing. I wasn't living in the shadow of my past anymore. I was alive in my present, and for the first time that felt like enough. As weeks turned to months, I settled deeper into this new life I was building. My mornings were filled with coffee and quiet, my own little rituals that I'd created. I'd wake up early, sit by the window, and watch the city come alive, taking in the sounds and sights without a rush to be anywhere or anyone but myself. Sometimes I'd catch the faintest whiff of his cologne in the street, or pass by a cafe where we once shared breakfast. These small triggers would momentarily tug at my heart, but they no longer pulled me into a pit of sadness. Instead, they became markers of a life I had lived and left behind. A part of me, yes, but no longer my entire story. Lucas and I continued to see each other, each interaction adding a layer of quiet comfort to my life. He wasn't a sweeping romance or a dramatic escape. He was a steady hand, a kind smile, and a warm presence, someone who was genuinely interested in me and respected my boundaries. With Lucas, there was no need for masks or pretense. He knew about my past, about the betrayal that had shattered me, and he respected the space I needed to heal. One evening, as we sat across from each other at a cozy little bistro, he reached for my hand. "You know," he said softly, his thumb tracing circles on my palm, "I don't think I've ever met anyone as strong as you. It's like you've been through a fire and come out shining brighter." His words touched something deep inside me, something I hadn't even realized was still raw. I looked at him, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. He saw me. Not the broken pieces, not the scars, but the person who had survived. And in that moment I realized that maybe I was ready to let someone else in, not because I needed them to fix me, but because I was finally whole on my own. With time, our relationship deepened. We took things slow, and I cherished every small step forward. Each moment where we built something real and lasting. We traveled together, went on spontaneous road trips, and even spent quiet weekends doing nothing more than sharing a meal or laughing over a movie. It was simple, but it was real. And for me, that was more than enough. Eventually, I moved into a larger studio apartment, one with high ceilings and plenty of natural light, perfect for painting. My work became an outlet not just for my pain but for my growth, my joy, my resilience. The abstract lines and shapes that flowed from my brush began to reflect a new chapter of my life, one filled with color and light. Then one crisp autumn morning, I received an unexpected email. It was from him, my ex. Just seeing his name brought back a familiar ache, a reminder of wounds that had scarred over but would never fully disappear. His message was brief but pointed. He'd heard about my art exhibit from a mutual acquaintance, and he wanted to know if we could meet, if he could see how I was doing. There was a part of me that wanted to ignore the message, to let it go unanswered and fade into the background of my new life. But there was also a part of me that felt curious, maybe even compassionate. So I agreed to meet him, feeling oddly detached, like I was about to face a ghost from a distant past. We met at a small coffee shop on a quiet street. When he walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked older, his face worn, with a hint of sadness that hadn't been there before. I saw a man who had been through his own version of the storm, one he had created himself but hadn't expected to last so long. He sat down, offering a small, hesitant smile, and we exchanged pleasantries. "I wanted to apologize," he began, his voice low, heavy, "for everything. I was so caught up in my own selfishness, in my own fantasies, I suppose. I hurt you, and there's nothing I can say to make that right." I listened, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. His words didn't fill me with anger or sorrow. Instead, they felt like echoes from a distant memory, things I had already heard in my heart a long time ago. "Thank you," I said, keeping my tone gentle but firm. "But I've made peace with it. I've moved on." He looked down, nodding slowly. "I see that," he murmured, and for a moment, he looked lost, as if he were grappling with a realization that had only now fully hit him. "I didn't think you'd ever forgive me. And I don't think I ever really forgave myself." Those words lingered in the air between us, carrying a sadness I didn't expect to feel. I'd spent so long resenting him, questioning how he could betray me, how he could discard everything we'd built together for a fantasy. But now, looking at him, I realized he was already paying the price for his choices. He had created his own prison, one that he would have to live with long after I had walked free. We spoke for a little while longer, sharing updates about our lives, our families. It was a strangely bittersweet conversation, one that felt like closing the last door to a chapter I'd left behind. When we parted, I didn't look back. I walked away, feeling lighter, unburdened, as if I'd finally laid to rest the last remnants of that old pain. In the months that followed, I poured myself deeper into my art. My work gained attention, and I started selling pieces not just locally but to buyers across the country. Each canvas was a testament to my journey, to the strength I had found within myself. With every brushstroke, I told my story, not as a victim but as someone who had reclaimed her life and found beauty in the broken pieces. Eventually, I opened my own gallery, a small, intimate space that felt like an extension of my soul. I filled it with my work and the work of other artists who had stories to tell, voices that needed to be heard. The gallery became a place of healing, not just for me but for everyone who walked through its doors. People would come, drawn to the warmth and authenticity of the space, and sometimes they would share their own stories with me, stories of heartbreak, resilience, and hope. It was a reminder that we are all connected, that our stories, no matter how painful, are threads in the greater tapestry of life. Lucas was there with me every step of the way, his unwavering support a constant reminder that real love was patient, gentle, and steady. He didn't try to overshadow my journey or make it about him. He simply walked beside me, offering his hand when I needed it, and letting me be free when I needed space. Our relationship was built on mutual respect, on a shared understanding that we both carried scars but were stronger because of them. One evening, as we stood in my gallery, surrounded by my art and the stories it held, he looked at me with a softness that took my breath away. "You know," he said, his voice filled with warmth, "I've never met anyone as brave as you. You took the worst pain and turned it into something beautiful. That's a rare gift." I looked at him, feeling a depth of gratitude that I couldn't put into words. "I think I finally understand that sometimes we have to go through the fire to find our true selves," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "And I couldn't have done it alone." In that moment, surrounded by the work that told my story, with Lucas by my side, I felt a quiet, profound peace settle over me. I had been broken, shattered by betrayal, but I had also been rebuilt, stronger, wiser, and more compassionate than before. And as I looked out at the world, at the life I had created from the ashes, I knew that no matter what the future held, I was finally truly whole. The years slipped by in the gentlest, most unexpected way, filled with an ease that had once seemed impossible. Each season brought small transformations, new paintings, deeper friendships, and a quiet, constant growth alongside Lucas. Our love was rooted in respect, in the kind of everyday moments that don't always feel like milestones but that build a life together. One morning coffee, one shared glance, one comfortable silence at a time. It was in the way he would reach for my hand in crowded rooms, or how he'd bring home my favorite tea on a rainy day. It was simple, understated, but more real and powerful than any fairy tale romance I'd once dreamed of. The gallery became a cornerstone of our lives. Over time, it grew from a humble space to a small, thriving art community. We held open exhibits, artist-led workshops, and even hosted events that encouraged people to share their own journeys. People started recognizing the gallery as a place of healing, where art told stories that went beyond the surface. Every artist that walked through our doors, every patron who left touched by the work they'd seen, became part of a community of shared resilience. One evening, after a particularly successful opening night, Lucas and I found ourselves sitting in the middle of the empty gallery. The guests had left, the lights were dimmed, and the walls were filled with art that spoke of transformation, healing, and courage. I looked around, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude.